Welcome to the Global Research News Hour, produced in cooperation with CKUW-FM Radio in Winnipeg and the Centre for Research on Globalization at globalresearch.ca. And here's your host, Michael Welch.
Welcome to the Global Research News Hour Summer Series. My name is Michael Welch. The Global Research News Hour is a weekly public affairs broadcast produced at CKUW 95.9 FM in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, on occupied Anishinaabe territory on the homeland of the Métis Nation, in partnership with the Centre for Research on Globalization. Our shows air on partnering radio stations across Canada and the United States and are podcast at the website globalresearch.ca. This week, we present the conclusion of a two-part interview with journalist and documentary filmmaker Robbie Martin about his film series A Very Heavy Agenda and its depiction of the rise and influence of the neoconservatives in Washington, D.C. In part one, Martin described the inspiration behind making the film, the post-9/11 atmosphere in which the neocons flourished, and the neocons' role in fostering the new Cold War mentality in the Trump era. In part two, he recalls the largely forgotten Anthrax attacks in the days immediately following 9/11 and addresses how at least one supposedly hard-hitting media outlet came to adopt and promote U.S. imperialist narratives. Later in the broadcast, we will re-air an interview recorded in December of 2017 with the founder of consortiumnews.com and legendary investigative reporter, the late Robert Parry, which focuses on how and why investigative journalism in the United States has become corrupted and co-opted to serve great power interests. But first, here is Global Research News Hour contributor Scott Price with part two of his interview with Robbie Martin on the Global Research News Hour in the summer.
They aired a free block of programming over public airwaves in 2014 in Eastern Europe. Who does that? Who does that at the very beginning stages of like a new Cold War run-up? What media company does that? And, you know, that sounds very similar to the way that the BBC and Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty operated, is broadcasting content adversarial against Russia in Eastern Europe.
Through the late 20th and early 21st century, the neoconservatives loomed large in American foreign policy. The War on Terror, the war in Iraq, the Bush administration. In 2018, it may seem that their power and influence has waned, but in fact, many of these neoconservatives still hold influence, and their legacy has had a much larger impact on politics and society. In this Global Research News Hour special, we talk with journalist, filmmaker, and musician Robbie Martin on his three-part documentary, A Very Heavy Agenda. This film series covers the rise and continued influence of the neoconservatives. In part two of this Global Research News Hour special, Robbie Martin talks about the Anthrax attacks and how they were used to frame the War on Terror, and how Vice became a conduit for U.S. foreign policy propaganda. The second thing I want to talk about is those anthrax attacks, and of course that's a whole can of worms also in and of itself, and I believe you have a whole documentary specifically on this, correct?
I do, yeah. It's much shorter. It's I made it before A Very Heavy Agenda, and it's about a 45-minute documentary. Right,
but the other thing too is when I was watching this, how it was used in a way to justify kind of the war in Iraq in a way, because then that connects with WMDs.
Absolutely.
You know, so could you just, I mean, again, a big can of worms here, but could you just kind of like explain this a little bit about what happened there with the
Sure.
Anthrax attacks? Because also, I mean, just as a comment, I totally forgot about that completely. And then when watching the documentary and then hear you talk about it like on your podcast and stuff, all this stuff started flooding back, and I was like, oh right, yeah, that was early on, that was in that period, that was a huge talking point. And I was like, how did I forget? It's just odd to me that I somehow totally forgot about this. But anyways, just kind of explain that a little bit.
Well, first I just wanted to say I'm really happy to hear you say it all came flooding back for you, because that was kind of one of my intentions. It wasn't even really an artistic choice. It was, I'm a believer in the idea of like state-dependent memory, and most of the time you hear that it has to do with drugs or psychedelics, but when it comes to traumatic incidents, I think it's also very important and key. So, and I went into this documentary after I made American Anthrax. When I made a very heavy agenda, I knew that most of the people don't even remember the anthrax attacks that I just randomly encounter. So my goal was, if I put a chronological timeline of it and sort of re-immerse the viewer into this memory that, you know, they probably lived through and watched on TV but don't even remember it, then maybe some of those memories will come flooding back. So I'm really glad to hear that had that kind of effect on you, because I feel that that's something that if you just expose people to just video clips of the anthrax attacks and sort of show them how it was linked to Iraq and these things, then it would really shock most people. But they would also not just be shocked; they would anchor them back to a different part of their life where they would remember and be like, oh wow, now I remember that trauma and sort of that fear, that heightened experience. And you brought up Iraq. I'm a personal believer, and this is something that Glenn Greenwald and other journalists have also posited, the idea that the Iraq War wouldn't have been possible to sell to the American public if it was not for the anthrax attacks. I am a strong believer in that being the reality. I see the anthrax attacks, as the knockout punch. 9/11 was an isolated incident. It took place in multiple cities, but it was mostly on the East Coast in a very small, relative geographical area. Happened on a single day. But it wasn't just the 9/11 attacks themselves that enabled the hysterical climate for the Iraq War. It was the idea that terrorism would keep happening, that terrorists would try to use biological weapons, because Al-Qaeda was so crazy, they said, that they're going to try to kill us, using bioweapons or chemical weapons. And the anthrax attack essentially provided that that narrative. Because if 9/11 just happened by itself and nothing else happened after that, the Bush administration and the rest of the Homeland Security Department and the media class wouldn't have been able to really sell us on the idea that terrorism was going to be a regularly occurring thing. Having the anthrax attacks happen, and I should mention also, it wasn't just a single anthrax letter that was sent in the mail. There were 4 letters that were found. There were 5 deceased. And there were also dozens infected. But that might sound small, and it might sound like I'm exaggerating this idea that this is this much hysteria and fear over it. But if you actually read, there are some actual interesting stats in, and I can't remember the title of it, but it was an anthrax book that I just read. One of the last ones I managed to pick up a copy of. Actually goes through and does a statistical analysis of all the copycat anthrax letters that were sent through the country at the time. And there were something like thousands of cases of this happening. So what you had on top of the real letters was piggybacking of all these hoaxers and pranksters and people all across the country sending copycat letters too. So that the climate at the time was so amped up, so heightened, that it appeared that a terrorist or a group of terrorists was sending hundreds of letters through the mail. And this is in maybe a 3 or 4 month period, starting in October. It was discovered later that there were really only 4 letters found that actually contained anthrax, and they were sent to media and government figures. The 2 government figures that they were sent to, oddly, were 2 of the only people who were delaying the passage of the USA Patriot Act during the Bush administration, Tom Daschle and Patrick Leahy. That's a very odd 2 people to be selected for that attack, I think. And other people have speculated that perhaps this was actually the work of someone in the Bush administration who desperately wanted to pass the Patriot Act, to strip us all of civil rights. It's even hard to quantify how much our civil rights were stripped with that Patriot Act. So in terms of how it got us to the Iraq War, I should stress that if you look at every other Iraq WMD's hoax story, because all of them were either cooked up intelligence, doctored intelligence, or leaked, lies of omission to the media about aluminum tubes, about Muhammad Atta's meeting with Iraqi officials in, Iraq or Baghdad or Hamburg. I forgot where they said they met. If you look at all the other the other things that connect Iraq to Al Qaeda, or this idea of WMDs, they had a nuclear program, they had chemical weapons, they had sarin. None of these things actually turned out to be true, and none of them actually had any effect over here. But one of the remaining Iraq War WMD narratives that stuck was that Iraq had a biological weapons program. They had anthrax stockpiles. That was something you heard the Bush administration say. Colin Powell even held up the vial at the UN. And that was about 2 years after the anthrax attack, or less, maybe 2.5 years after. But in between that period where Colin Powell held up the vial and the anthrax being sent through the mail, there was an ongoing anthrax attack happening in the country. So when you have the Bush administration all of a sudden going out saying Saddam has WMDs, anthrax stockpiles, he doesn't have to spell it out 100%, because this is how the Bush administration was so clever about it. They never directly blamed Saddam Hussein for the attacks. What they did was they continually put out propaganda about how Saddam has anthrax stockpiles during the attacks, without actually telling the American public who was behind them. And actually Bush speculated that it was probably Al Qaeda. But it's very important because everyone really forgets, I think, how this three-way connection was created between Saddam Hussein, Al Qaeda, and 9/11. How did they manage to get that to sink in? It wasn't just because the Bush administration lied about the meetings and all that stuff. None of that stuff ended up having any real concrete proof. The only thing that really affected us here were the anthrax attacks. Psychologically speaking, without spelling it out, that's how the Bush administration got that idea to sink in. WMDs was a real thing. It wasn't just a talk of foreign policymakers. It was because it was being sent through the mail and killing us at the time. So, and then of course, there were people leaking to media figures like Brian Ross on ABC that it had hallmarks of Saddam Hussein's biological weapons program. So you had that propaganda coming out too, but you see, the neocons and Bush were clever enough to not spell it out 100%. And Bush had neocons like Robert Kagan and Bill Kristol and people who weren't in the administration kind of connecting the rest of the dots in the media, like Charles Krauthammer, other people, alleging that this is probably the work of Saddam Hussein.
On to sort of the rebranding of the neoconservative hawkish positions, I think to me your political analysis on Vice News is one of the sharpest and useful there is. I mean, there's a lot of people who've talked about Vice, but I think you have you base it in like a political analysis. And basically how now Vice pretty much echoes U.S. foreign policy positions. If you look at Vice coverage of Ukraine, Venezuela, Russia, North Korea, they've all pretty much taken like full-blown hawkish positions, but they hide it under layers of irony and feigning that they are non-ideological, just I think in the style that they produce these things. So could you talk about that shift with Vice? I mean, I think there was always a reactionary political bent to it, but I mean, now it's just over the last several years, it's just full-blown hawkish position. So how does that happen, and like why is Vice the perfect vehicle for U.S. foreign policy propaganda?
Well, it's all very valid questions, and I guess I'll just start with something that I don't know if I think it's revealed in part 3 of A Very Heavy Agenda, but it's something that's been well known for a while, is that the founder of neoconservatism, Irving Kristol, Bill Kristol's father, was actually the co-editor for a magazine that was popular in Europe called Encounter, that was made for liberal intellectuals. It wasn't a super popular magazine. It wasn't meant for people on the right side of the spectrum. It was meant for like artists and intellectuals. And stuff like that in Europe. And it turned out that this magazine was being primarily funded by the CIA. And Irving Kristol said he didn't know it was being funded by the CIA, that he was annoyed when he found out. I don't believe any of that. I think that he was actually part of working for the CIA. I think that was actually his job. I didn't put that in my movie because that's more speculation on my part. But that being said, I think that this type of thing has been done by American foreign policy propagandists and information war types and intelligence agencies for a very long time. This is a magazine that was being printed and distributed in the 1960s. So you go all the way to now, something like Vice magazine is almost kind of the perfect conduit to pass the threshold of the young, cynical, mind, and to get them basically to believe whatever they're telling them, because it's, Vice magazine started as this edgy, sex-positive, drug-positive, really edgy sort of culture magazine, and people fell in love with it. I mean, it became a big thing. In the United States, I remember even in the early aughts, it was very, very popular. It was also free. It was freely distributed, which I'm still kind of confused about how they afforded to do that, just getting enough advertising money to print it for free. I think that needs to be closer examined. But that aside, they eventually started their own HBO show. I think it was around when Obama got in office. Maybe it was around 2010, a little later. So Vice actually started their own TV show on HBO, and it started just as like Shane Smith himself, the owner of Vice, doing this sort of adrenaline junkie adventure tourism, going around all these places in the world that seemed really dangerous. And like the one I remember most is them going to Haiti. And then him just talking about all the shit on the beach in Haiti. And that was like a Vice News segment. And, it was a very popular sort of edgy show at the time. But what I didn't know about it is that it was being co-produced by, and one of their main consultant was Fareed Zakaria of the Council on Foreign Relations, and also CNN guy. He's one of these neoliberal think tank quasi-journalists. And Bill Maher, famous politically incorrect comedian. He has Real Time with Bill Maher, and he actually produced it and helped fund it. So he helped bring this Vice News show to HBO. And Bill Maher has always sort of been this guy who pretends to be some kind of libertarian, free speech, really real liberal guy. But he's quite the bigot. I mean, he's quite an Islamophobe. He seems to subscribe to a lot of terrible foreign policy platforms. But what I noticed is, even just with already knowing that Bill Maher was involved and all that kind of stuff, the part that really started to bother me was seeing their dishonest coverage of the Sochi Olympics and the Ukraine Civil War, essentially. And from there, I was kind of like, well, I'm just going to start looking at this more closely and really try to figure out what their narrative is. Like, what is the narrative they're putting out? Because as you said, they act like they don't have an editorial slant on this show. It's usually a younger reporter who's just going out, kind of seemingly naively covering a story and just along for the ride. A lot of it's like kind of fly on the wall. The reporters aren't asking very adversarial questions. It's mostly just like a documentary kind of thing. But I started noticing something very specific very early on when I started looking at this, is that their foreign policy slant seemed to be almost identical to the Obama administration and the U.S. State Department's foreign policy slant. And once I started noticing that and how consistently true that was for Vice, I started noticing other strange things, such as the BBG, the Broadcasting Board of Governors, is the U.S. state media arm, that we have all these branches all around the world putting out U.S. state-sponsored content, similar to RT in Russia. I noticed that the BBG seemed like they were especially excited about Vice running a lot of their content in their reports and on their Vice news segments. And you can actually see this on the BBG's auditing reports from the years 2014 to around 2016, is they seem particularly proud of Vice and the eagerness that Vice had to share their content. So that's not just Vice mirroring the content of this Obama State Department. It's Vice literally using stories and segments from literal U.S. state-funded, State Department-produced media. And that State Department-produced, media arm posting on their own website, on their government website, about how excited they are about Vice for using all their content. So that was something else I noticed, and I thought that's awfully strange that this supposedly edgy millennial news outlet that just had started their own show not too long ago is this eager to use all this U.S. state-funded media content. And that similarly, that branch of the U.S. state, government was very excited about that relationship as well. So, that was the second thing I noticed that was really strange. And then I just started noticing that Obama seemed to be giving all this exclusive access to Vice, which says something in and of itself. There's definitely ways you can perceive what kind of favoritism is given to certain media figures. I mean, just look at Trump, only giving these long interviews to people like Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson and no other people from, no other household name media figures. Obama was giving exclusive access to Biden and different people from his cabinet to Shane Smith of Vice, seemingly more than he was giving to other media networks. And, you could look at this and say, oh, well, the Obama administration and their people are, have traditionally always been good at tapping into this millennial hipster media circuit. I mean, look at Obama going on Mark Maron. Look at him going on Between Two Ferns. But what I saw with Vice was something much deeper than that, where it was the Obama administration not only giving them extremely good access, but also trying to put out narratives on Vice News. And this all sort of culminated with a strange final Vice News special with Obama, or actually it wasn't the final one. I think this is like the second to last one they did with him, where Obama was literally the host of the segment. And Obama takes Shane Smith to a prison, maximum security prison, to talk to prisoners about how deplorable prison life is. And I don't know what to make of that other than it being a White House-sponsored Vice News segment. If you watch it, you can understand what I'm saying. But it's very surreal, because what other media network, especially one marketed towards millennials, would get away with doing something like that? Have the President of the United States host a segment. I mean, it just looks bad. It looks funny. It smells funny. So the fact that they would do that so nakedly, it really showed me that they actually don't care, and then maybe even in some ways they're trying to rebrand this idea of a liberal government being linked arm in arm with this hipster media outlet, and that's actually a good thing. That's cool. It's not something bad. And then I guess the last thing I'll mention is that Alyssa Mastromonaco, one of the people who spent the most time with Obama in the White House, who was with him on Air Force One, taking his notes, constantly shadowing him, becomes the COO of Vice after she leaves her White House spot. It's a very strange transition there. So there's more I can go into. I mean, Rupert Murdoch owns something like 15% of Vice now. Disney owns a large chunk. But there's a lot more strange stuff with it. I mean, Simon Otsarowski, the host of Russian Roulette, their series about Ukraine, actually whitewashes the Azov Battalion's neo-Nazi ties multiple times throughout the series. And we now know how brutally and openly neo-Nazi they are. There's no hiding it anymore. So Vice was trying to hide that. And I've been accused of being paranoid and crazy for even pointing this out.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's interesting. I've actually tried to talk to people who have left Vice about this, and they're kind of like, yeah, you kind of could see what you're saying, but I didn't notice it while I was there, and it's like, I just don't see how they didn't notice it. I mean, to me, it was just so obvious from the very beginning that something smelled funny about their foreign policy coverage, but there were just other things I found during the making of my film, Scott, like that Shane Smith says on video that they aired a free block of programming over public airwaves in 2014 in Eastern Europe. Who does that?
Whoa.
Who does that at the very beginning stages of like a new Cold War run-up? What
Whoa.
media company does that? And, that sounds very similar to the way that the BBC and Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty operated, is broadcasting content adversarial against Russia in Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they already do.
Yeah.
So I found that very odd that he would admit to doing that and just act like, and just say it in passing. Like that was one of their marketing strategies. And also they have branches in over 120 countries. I mean, they are embedded all over the world now. I mean, they have so many stringers and freelancers. They're a giant operation.
Yeah.
So if someone wanted to use them like an intelligence network even, or for surveillance or whatever, it wouldn't, they seem like it's kind of a perfect setup, actually, in a way, even just in terms of their reach and their amount of translators they have for intelligence.
Yeah, and then kind of talking like the second part about Vice and sort of their position, like we were just talking about, this access they get, and then the kind of lines that they push through their media empire, basically what they have now. This is one thing I was thinking. Do you think there's a connection between the lack of an anti-war movement and news outlets like Vice, who speak and do really well with younger audiences? Like, do you think like this is, I don't know, like, I don't know how intentional it is, but it seems like it's really good in neutralizing like principled anti-war positions because of, what we were just sort of talking about.
No, I think it's absolutely, you just hit on something totally true that's happening, is there's all these, people won't seek out, they believe that they have all these alternative voices, in places like Vice or BuzzFeed or Daily Beast. But in fact, if you look at all three of those outlets slant on U.S. foreign policy, it's virtually always the same. They're almost always towing U.S. foreign policy line, at least during the Obama administration. Things have changed since Trump got in office. That's a whole other can of worms. But yeah, I think that that's completely true to say, is that the anti-war movement, at least in any mainstream sense, has been pretty much completely neutralized. And even like the sub-mainstream anti-war movement that, you used to hear about anti-war protests. I mean, I think the last one was a large group of people protesting the White House when Obama threatened to bomb Syria because they had crossed the red line. That was one of the last major groundswell protests that the anti-war movement was really a part of, that I think kind of penetrated at least partly through the mainstream. Since then, though, I think that it has been largely neutralized. Even the idea that we are perpetually bombing ISIS in Syria, even people on the anti-war left who are journalists and who do work in that area, they don't even really write about how that's an endless part of the endless war on terror. It's kind of like that's kind of just accepted, that we just need to eradicate ISIS and just keep bombing Syria and Iraq over and over again until killing unknown scores of civilians. So I think that unfortunately the anti-war movement has largely disappeared. The drone wars have increased under Trump. More civilians are being killed, more bombs are being dropped under Trump than were under Obama. He's doing it at a higher rate. You don't really hear much outcry, really. It just seems like mostly the consensus, even from the, I don't want to say the left, but the liberal side of the spectrum, is calling for more war, and how we should overthrow Assad, how maybe we should, squeeze Putin more. Maybe we should sanction North Korea and starve North Koreans more. That's sort of the rhetoric from the left right now. Fortunately, there's not. The anti-war stuff saying that we should keep our hands off of those countries and maybe not sanction Venezuela or talk about overthrowing them. I mean, there's very few voices out there saying that kind of stuff right now. I mean, even shows like Democracy Now! In the United States have shifted more towards a regime change perspective in countries like Syria, which is really, shocking.
Yeah.
But that's where we are now.
My name is Michael Welch, and you're listening to the Global Research News Hour, airing on CKUW 95.9 FM in Winnipeg and on partner radio stations across Canada and the United States. The show is available for download from the site globalresearch.ca. We're listening to part 2 of an interview by Global Research News Hour contributor Scott Price with journalist and filmmaker Robbie Martin. Here's more of that conversation.
I guess one of the last things, about a very heavy agenda is that one of the major takeaways that I really got from the film, and what I really appreciated, is that you kind of show that there aren't really secret conspiracies, and that many of these elites and these sorts of people are very open about what they want and what they want to do. And you show that through their own words, and you kind of let these people sort of you use the own rope that they have to kind of hang themselves with in a way. But yet people, I think, are still really attracted to the more cartoonish kind of conspiracy theory kind of things. And I think about that, and I also think about, at the same time, we are really living in one of the most propagandized times, and it is becoming harder to really discern what is happening in the world, because, these neocons, they don't actually, as you kind of establish in the film and what we've talked about, they don't really care about what the facts are. It's just whatever they can bend, whatever they can rewrite history into. And we just talked about Vice and how they portray things. So, I mean, I'm just wondering about someone who's really kind of like yourself, who's tuned into this. How do you stay focused on what matters, and how do you kind of keep sanity and sort of a sort of decent mental health? I mean, what are your thoughts about this? Because it seems things are getting more surreal and even more propagandized than I even thought, in the lead up to the Iraq War. I think we're in a way worse stage now.
Yeah, that's a really hard one. I mean, gosh. I think just for myself, I try to make the world smaller in terms of what I focus on. If I tried to look at everything at once that bothered me and tried to make sense of it and tried to address it and fight against it, I think there'd be no way to do it. I would just probably be a depressed mess all the time. I wouldn't be able to do anything. I'd be paralyzed by it. So I guess just from my own personal strategy and the work that I do, is to narrow things down to where I think I can do the most damage, I guess,
Right.
And fighting against it. And for me, I've chosen some, very specific areas. So I'll continue to do work and dig in the subject of the 2001 Anthrax attacks. But, in terms of just charting what the neocons are doing and what their plans are, like you said, a lot of this stuff is being talked about out in the open. Even if, it depended on what, you don't have to be a truther, to think it's valuable information. But the fact that Project for the New American Century in the year 2000 talked about their eagerness for needing a new Pearl Harbor, perhaps tracking that back then might have prepared you better for the era to come in terms of what their propaganda was going to be like after 9/11 and things like that, and where it was going to go. Because a lot of this stuff, at least for me, it used to be playing catch up. I would be looking at the documents that were written very, a while ago, years ago, to try to understand the present. So for me, I try to read documents as they come out in the present to understand what's going to happen in the future, and to try to at least, get a better handle on what that might be, so that when it happens, I can be better prepared to address it, I guess. And one of those ways that's shaping up now is this build up to what seems like a Trump's administration beating the drums for war with Iran. and that's something that I've been looking at very closely for the last couple of years. So it hasn't been a surprise to me, I guess, is partly what I'm trying to say.
Right.
But I think for regular people out there, I don't blame people for wanting to unplug and not being able to follow what's going on, because I agree with you that it's one of the most challenging and intense propaganda eras in human history. And so I don't want to leave people with a cynical, note or suggestion on my part, but like, if you want to do this kind of work and you want to pay attention to it, I would try to narrow it down to something, because otherwise it is going to drive you crazy.
You have been listening to the Global Research News Hour special with journalist, filmmaker, and musician Robbie Martin on his documentary series, A Very Heavy Agenda, that explores the rise and continued influence of the neoconservatives on U.S. foreign policy and society. You can buy or stream A Very Heavy Agenda at averyheavyagenda.com. Music for this special provided by Fluorescent Gray, aka Robbie Martin. For the Global Research News Hour, I'm Scott Price.
We just heard part 2 of an exclusive interview with Robbie Martin on the rise and influence of the neocons in Washington, D.C. For the remainder of the program, we will air an interview with legendary reporter Robert Parry, which first aired on December 7th, 2017. This interview was conducted less than 3 weeks before a debilitating stroke, to be followed a month later by his untimely death at the age of 68. Robert Parry is a longtime investigative journalist and the editor of ConsortiumNews.com, the first investigative news magazine based on the internet. He was one of the reporters who helped expose the Iran-Contra scandal for the Associated Press in the mid-1980s, and in tribute to his work over the years, he was honored with the Martha Gellhorn Prize for Journalism recently. He has written a number of stories critical of the mainstream media treatment of Russiagate, among other current stories crowding the airwaves and print media. He joins us now from his home in Arlington, I believe?
Yes, Arlington, Virginia, right?
Thank you very much for joining us, Robert Parry.
Thank you.
So I'm wondering if you could just comment on some of the key failings in journalistic practice that you've seen as we get into modern times.
Well, I arrived in Washington for the Associated Press in 1977, so it was, and I've been working. I was working in a newspaper and for AP for a few years before that in New England. But when I came, it was the national press in Washington was still influenced by what had happened in the 70s, particularly the Watergate scandal and the stories about Vietnam, the Pentagon Papers. So there was a real skepticism that many mainstream journalists brought to what they were hearing from the U.S. government, and that was sort of a healthy thing. I mean, there were obviously cases where it went overboard, and other times when there wasn't enough skepticism. But there was more of that mix back then. As we got through the 1980s, the Reagan administration was very aggressive in trying to put this more independent press back in line. They spent a lot of time and effort, what they call perception management, and they realized that if they could control how the mainstream press was reporting stories, it would also help them control the American people, who had gotten also a bit out of control in the 1970s and the late 60s. So there was that sort of reality that was beginning to emerge, and as we get into the 90s, there was a veering away from any kind of serious journalism at all. Mostly was focused on more personality issues, Bill Clinton's sex life, and there was kind of a trivialization of the news. And then, of course, you get into the period of the 9/11 and the George W. Bush administration, where the mainstream press, simply failed to do its due diligence in terms of trying to check on what the claims were about the Iraq War. There was this more and more pressure to get in line, to be quote patriotic, as if that was sort of the role of journalists, to take the side of the U.S. government and not question the U.S. government too much. And we've now moved through this era where there is now this attitude of that the press should get on board and get rid of Donald Trump. I think the country was shocked in many cases that he won. I think maybe he was shocked that he won. And there was almost an embarrassment. There was a sense of humiliation about having this guy who was considered somewhat of a lowlife by many and not very smart and rather bigoted and simple-minded, and that he had risen to this pinnacle of American political power. One might say it says a lot about the dysfunction of the American political media system, but there was this attitude that we started seeing a year or so ago of trying to reverse it and looking for ways for the press to sort of join what was known as the resistance. And so the press has, the mainstream press anyway, has sort of jumped on board very both feet in this idea that they could use the issue of Russia and its purported influence on Trump as some way to both negate the humiliation of having Trump win. We could blame it on some foreigners, the Russians, and also maybe figure out a way to negate the election and impeach him or throw him out somehow. There's that sort of lingering hope as well, I suppose. But that, again, has taken the media in a direction beyond what I'd understood it to be, which was to give everyone a fair shake, try to be as objective as possible, not be part of some agenda, but rather try to look at the facts and present them to the American people as fairly and as honestly as you can. So there's now been this almost a break in how the media is functioning, where some of those old-fashioned principles have been jettisoned in this desire to both demonize Russia as we enter a sort of a new Cold War, a very dangerous new Cold War, and also use that as a way to discredit and destroy Trump if possible.
Today, it seems as if we have so many choices, and including the internet, that there seems to have been a shrinking in terms of the areas of allowable investigation or news that, as the New York Times masthead would say, is fit to print. Does that not seem a little bit contradictory?
Well, I think you have different forces at play. Obviously, you have economic forces which tended to lead toward a greater consolidation of the news media as we knew it. So you had, in many cases, the number of family newspapers and various somewhat alternative views, even if they weren't as ideological, perhaps, but they were more idiosyncratic. You had different families running different papers, and some had different points of view. That was pretty much wiped out as the corporatization of the press went forward. But you did have, on the other hand, you had some more first cable outlets appearing, and then you also have the emergence of the internet. And as I was sort of finding it harder and harder to operate within the confines of the mainstream press in the 90s, that's when the internet sort of became available to us. There was the ability of the American people and the world public to access more and more diverse opinion, and now we're seeing a real pushback against that. And I think one of the darkest elements of the RussiaGate brouhaha has been that a side of that has been to use that as an excuse to begin to silence the independence of the internet. Starting almost a year ago when there was a front page story in the Washington Post based on an anonymous group called Prop or Not, and this group decided that they were going to pick 200 internet sites, including consortium news, which they would just deem Russian propaganda. And I guess the reason we fell into that was that we had been skeptical about a number of claims or narratives coming out of the State Department. And that includes things like back in the 2000s of the Iraq War. We were skeptical of that, but we were also skeptical of some of the claims being made by Obama's State Department and how they were presenting the Syrian conflict, for instance, how they were presenting the Ukraine conflict. And what we were pushing for was a more thorough, objective, multi-sided view of those conflicts, not the Johnny One-Note approach that the State Department was trying to take. But because of that, we were lumped in these 200 sites that were deemed propaganda. The Washington Post runs this on the front page. The group is anonymous. They don't have to identify themselves as prop or not group. And that was sort of a marker of where we were headed. And since then, there was more and more pressure on Google and Facebook to begin to de-rank, as they would put it, or isolate, marginalize Internet sites, no matter how good they were, no matter how serious their journalism was. But if they were going in a different direction from what the New York Times was saying was true, or the Washington Post was saying was true, or groups like PolitiFact was saying is true, or then there were some Internet sites that were just establishment favored, like Bellingcat, which always seems to endorse whatever the establishment point of view is. Those groups were considered serious. They were put into something called the First Draft Coalition, and their job has become to decide what's true and what isn't true, or what is propaganda and what isn't. And if they give you a thumbs down, you get dropped from Google's search engine, basically. And it used to be that, like Consortium News, on stories we covered, we would be at the top of some of these items because we got a lot of reads, and maybe not as many as some of the big papers, but we got a lot. And so the searchers would find us. The idea of this new approach is to make sure that only the mainstream publications get seen. So if you go for instance, today if you went on Ukraine News, you would see what the New York Times might have to say, or the Washington Post, or even the Daily Mail, or different publications, some of which are rather sloppy in their journalism themselves, but you will see fewer and fewer of these alternative voices. There's been a determination to try to silence that, to shut it down. In journalism, we used to pride ourselves in presenting both sides of the story. That was what I learned in journalism. You always want to present both sides of a story, and maybe multiple sides of a story, because that way the American people are given the choices. They can decide if they want to agree with this or that. That's the idea of democracy. It's the idea of the Enlightenment. But now the major news organizations in the United States and these major technology companies have teamed up with a goal of preventing that. You're only supposed to hear what is approved for you to hear. You see, what you're getting is now a less of a menu of choices in terms of trying to understand the world. And that's what the Internet had promised us, and there was the hope we had. And increasingly now, in the past year, under this umbrella of Russiagate, we are seeing a reversal of that.
There was a bill signed by Obama before he left office that allocated some $160 million to fighting Russian propaganda in the U.S. media. And so, I mean, some of the measures you've already mentioned, I imagine that's part of this. Are there other mechanisms that are being put in place that are continuing to restrict these the spectrum of debate and discussion?
Well, sure. I mean, and there was this $160 million package to fight propaganda, and a lot of that is now going to NGOs, to various academics who are now writing papers which have the predictable conclusion that all this is Russian propaganda. Anytime someone disagrees with the State Department, you're somehow a Russian propaganda agent. And so we're starting to see more and more of these studies, which and then the New York Times and the Washington Post and others will then say there's a new study from some academic that no one's ever heard of, but whose account will be treated very seriously. And so there's that. But before that, you had USAID, which was funding a number of these programs around the world, journalism programs to sort of present, to sort of support and to train and to equip people in these different countries to present stories that would be suitable to what the U.S. foreign policy interests were. That is, you would sort of have video cameras that would try to capture your opponents, whether a staged event or a real event, but put them in the worst possible light, and then those things are distributed on YouTube and various other means, often calls into the New York Times, which are then treated very seriously because they're coming from these sort of approved sources of information. But again, it goes against this idea of getting a really diverse, both sides of the story approach. We've seen also the National Endowment for Democracy, which came into play in 1983, which was one of Reagan's operations. And the goal was to start funding not just these political activist groups around the world, which would promote what the U.S. government wanted done in these countries, but you also had journalism groups being trained. And so you've built this. There's been built up this infrastructure of funding and training, which is designed to undercut the sovereignty of some of these governments. Now, not to say all these governments are great; a lot of them aren't. But often, the substitutes that the United States sort of prescribes for these countries end up being as bad or a lot worse. But that has been the approach that's been taken. And ultimately, that does spill back into the United States because many of these NGOs and other funded operations really operate out of Washington. They may have these satellite activities, but they are here, and so they begin to influence how the major news organizations are going to see things because they give press conferences, they put out papers, and so forth. So suddenly, you're starting to see much of this propaganda then pervade the American press as well. Mm-hmm. That becomes the problem as we go forward.
I wanted you to give us a little bit more insight into the exercise of what you refer to as groupthink. I'm wondering if you could think of any examples, perhaps in more recent years, that really stand out for you as a textbook example of how groupthink and journalists are disciplined into maintaining their role as purveying the standard, convenient U.S. imperial line.
Well, the classic case, obviously, is the Iraq War, when any journalist, and I would include Consortium News at the time, expressing skepticism about the WMD claims and the arguments for war, we were deemed Saddam apologists. That was sort of the smear that was thrown at us. We were doing our jobs, but we were mocked and not patriotic. So if you were in a mainstream news organization, you can't afford that. When I worked for AP and Newsweek and PBS back years ago, it was that way too. And if you were in the 1980s and the Reagan people were trying to call you sort of a Moscow stooge if we sort of come back to that, I guess. But if you were being called somehow unpatriotic for not supporting or questioning the invasion of Grenada or something, you would have similar problems. But what's also happened is that since there are fewer and fewer well-paying jobs in journalism, that is, that it's kind of a winner-take-all situation. There are some very high-paying jobs, and then pretty much there aren't very many middle-class jobs left because so many papers have shut down or consolidated, and so your choices aren't very good if you're trying to do real journalism that goes against the grain. You will be attacked, and you will be called names, and your editors will hear that. And most editors are mostly conflict averse. They've got their own jobs to worry about. And what happened to Gary Webb, the tragedy of Gary Webb, when he revived a story that I had been part of starting back in the 80s, the Contra drug story, and he revived it a decade later. And because that story had been squashed by a combination of the Reagan administration, which didn't want that story to be accepted, and major news organizations back then, the New York Times, the Washington Post, for instance, that just didn't want to believe it, no matter how good the evidence was, that when Webb tried to revive it, he was then, in terms of professionally, crushed. He was crushed not by the CIA as much as by the New York Times and the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, et cetera. And they ultimately drove him to suicide. They lost his job and lost his life, and it became something. It's a horrible story, but it's one of. It shows how groupthink functions. And it didn't even matter at some point that the the CIA, this Inspector General of the CIA, came out and admitted that, yes, the Contras were deeply involved in drug trafficking, and we knew it, and we covered up for it. That still didn't change the way the big papers were going to approach this, because they were determined to protect their own turf. They'd gotten it wrong, and they weren't going to admit otherwise. So we started seeing that kind of behavior. But we've seen it more recently, especially on things like Syria, where the mainstream press overwhelmingly took the side of the rebels, even though many of the rebels were involved with Al-Qaeda and then later the Islamic State. But still they were being portrayed as these nice guys against this evil government. So, we saw this in Ukraine, where it's all been presented as this one-sided story of Russian aggression, when the whole issue, more interesting issue, really was how senior officials of the Obama administration, including Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State, and the U.S. Ambassador Jeffrey Pyatt, how they essentially conspired to orchestrate a coup d'etat. There even was the release of their phone call in which they discussed who they were going to put as new leaders, and they talked about how to glue this thing, how to midwife this thing. So it didn't even matter how much evidence you had. The New York Times ignored that evidence when they did a piece a year or so afterwards saying there was no coup d'etat in Ukraine, that somehow the elected president, Yanukovych, just sort of wandered away. But they ignored things like the phone call. They ignored the evidence of a coup to say there was no coup. So you started seeing this increasingly, I would say, just really very bad journalism. But it is journalism operating in a propagandistic frame.
You've made a very solid case for the importance of supporting independent media like Consortium News, like this radio program. You've got a fundraiser happening right now this month. So is there anything that you could say to listeners who would like to, who are maybe thinking about whether or not they should be donating to your site?
Well, sure. I mean, I think the hope for democracy, a meaningful democracy, based on an informed electorate, an electorate that's respected in the sense that they can hear different points of view and their brains won't explode. Instead of being told, no, you just have to hear one side of a story because otherwise you're just too fragile. Our approach has been to sort of to challenge that notion. And we've done it without advertising. First of all, I think advertising on the internet has never been a particularly great business model. But secondly, you obviously compromise if you decide to go that way. There's no perfect way to raise money, I suppose, or because you need money to function. But I think the best way is to rely on our readers, people who have a diverse set of interests, who I hope will respect what we do, even if they may not want to hear something we're telling them. But we're telling them, we're giving them information that they really should need to know. But some people don't want to have their preconceptions challenged. I get that. But that's still the job of journalism, to give you information, whether you want it or don't want it. But if it's important and you should know it, we try to provide it and give context and the rest of it. So we do only 3 fundraisers a year because we don't like to bug our readers too much. And obviously the most important one is the end of year one, because that's when people do most of their donating because it's the end of the tax year and so forth. So we're hoping to people will go to consortiumnews.com and if they think we deserve their support, they'll give it.
Robert Parry, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much, and good luck with your fundraiser.
Okay, thank you.
That was one of the last interviews ever conducted with the legendary investigative journalist and ConsortiumNews.com founder and editor, Robert Parry. It first aired December 7th of 2017. Before that, we heard part 2 of a 2-part interview by Global Research NewsHour contributor Scott Price with journalist and documentary filmmaker Robbie Martin about the rise and influence of the Neocons. Music for this episode was by Fluorescent Grey, a.k.a. Robbie Martin. The Global Research NewsHour will be on hiatus for the rest of August. Repeat broadcasts will be available for download from the site, globalresearch.ca. New episodes will air in September. Thank you for joining us. My name is Michael Welch.